You're listening to Queer Skies, a podcast exploring queerness, astrology, and the intersection of both. In this episode, we invite the extraordinary Michael J. Morris back as a guest to help us explore the astrological terrain of 2020. We talk about Saturn and Jupiter's meetings with Pluto and the ways power structures and cancel culture might change. We talk about Mercury's carbonated retrogrades powered by Uranus. We talk about the Venus and Mars retrogrades this year and what lessons they bring for us in terms of survival and resistance. And we talk big picture about what Aquarius has in store for us as our attention shifts to this fixed sign. This is our longest episode yet, so sit back and relax because we've got Queer Skies ahead.
Welcome back once again to Queer Skies, where this time we're doing a lot more. We're covering 12 months of the year of 2020. It's me, Drew, with
Daniel. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you. It was like, we're both going to say it at the same time. Daniel and
Michael J. Morris.
Welcome back, Michael. So good to have you back for the third time now. So happy to have you back. This is, I think, your second Your Head's astrology podcast at this point. Is that right?
It is.
Cool. So hopefully you're just going to lead us on our way through this episode with all of your extra wisdom of 2020 already under your belt. Is there anything we want to say before we jump right in? No? Okay, let's jump right in. Where are we starting? We've got January starting out. We do have Saturn Pluto right out the gate, as has been talked about for, I feel like, all of the forecasts for 2019 have been already looking forward to January 2020. So I feel like especially the astrology conferences, Saturn Pluto was a big topic, even though it is technically happening at the beginning of 2020. But we do have some other interesting things happening in Capricorn this year as well, especially with the Jupiter-Pluto conjunctions that are taking place while Saturn's also hanging out in that area of the sky. So what do we have to say about Jupiter-Pluto?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm thinking about the Jupiter-Pluto conjunctions really in contrast to the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. So the Saturn-Pluto conjunction is going to perfect on January 12th, right at the beginning of the year. But it's been approaching, or that transit's been in place since Saturn moved into Capricorn in December 2017. And I feel like with that transit, with this approaching conjunction between Saturn and Pluto, the emphasis is really on the immense pressure that is on existing systems and power structures, the ways we've ordered and organized our lives, the ways that power acts on and through us in our bodies and in our lives. I'm thinking about Pluto as one of the ways we can think about Pluto is how power operates. And one of the ways we can think about Saturn is negation or refusal or rejection. So what I'm thinking about with that conjunction that happens at the beginning of the year is what kinds of power or ways of power operating are we saying no to? What ways of power being structured in our world and in our lives are we rejecting or refusing? And so then the Jupiter-Pluto conjunctions feel like a response to that. It feels like if the Saturn-Pluto conjunction is saying no to certain organizations of power, then the Jupiter-Pluto conjunctions raises the question, what forms of power do we want to affirm? To what sources of power do we want to say yes? And I'm thinking about, there's so many ways we could talk about power and affirmation. The two that come to mind are the idea of shared power, which is something that I think is a feminist ideal in a lot of contexts, but I was first introduced to by Starhawk in reclaiming witchcraft communities, the idea of shared power being very different than consolidated or individual power, or power being situated within some sort of head of a system. But I'm also thinking about Audre Lorde, always, and how at the beginning of the essay, Uses of the Erotic, she writes about the erotic as a source of power. And in that essay, she starts off by saying that in order for every system of oppression to perpetuate itself, it must corrupt and distort the sources of power within a culture of the oppressed that might provide any opportunity for change. And so we can see how the erotic has been repressed, distorted, so that it is not a source of power for the oppressed. And so in terms of this Jupiter-Pluto conjunction, those are some of the ways in which I've been reflecting on what are the organizations of power or ways of thinking about power that I want to affirm and say yes to. And those conjunctions happen 3 times. The first is around April 5th. And this is just 2 weeks after Saturn ingresses into Aquarius. So it's sort of like it feels like there's some relief from the pressure or the restraint of Saturn, but also now the ruler of Capricorn is in aversion. So there's not quite knowing how things are going to turn out, perhaps, in that initial conjunction. That initial conjunction is also within a 3-degree orb of a sextile to Mercury. So it feels like that first conjunction in April could be a time to start talking about what are new ways of organizing power. How do we approach structure and systems in some sort of new way, which is actually really consistent with how I'm thinking about Saturn and Aquarius anyway. But the idea of that Mercury sextile being an opportunity for discussion, for conversation, for communication, for sharing ideas around power. Then the second conjunction is June 30th. And both Jupiter and Pluto are retrograde at that point. So is Saturn. And this conjunction is sextile Neptune, which is also retrograde at that point. So with all of those retrogrades, I was thinking about how an affirmation of power isn't necessarily a call for inventing something new. Sometimes it means looking back to the ways that power has been organized in the past that we want to carry forward in some way. What ways have things been before the most recent era, whether we're looking to indigenous sources of wisdom, whether we're looking to matrilineal cultural organizations. What does looking back teach us about the kinds of power we want to affirm? And then the third conjunction is between Jupiter and Pluto is around November 12th. And Saturn is back in Capricorn at that point. It's separating, it's moving back towards Aquarius. But I get the sense that Saturn's presence there is offering not only reception, so providing resources to this conjunction, but also direction towards how Saturn might then carry some of those new ways of thinking or affirmations of power into the Saturn in Aquarius narrative as well. Those are my initial thoughts.
Yes, I love that. And what that makes me think of too is this piece that's related to the authority of those in power or who have influence, and how do we deal with that upheaval of that. And I think cancel culture is something that we've seen really pop up in the last couple of years. And there's, I think around the time that I noticed that getting really strong was Jupiter and Scorpio. And so here we are now, a couple years later. And what I think about, so there's this analogy that I was kind of thinking about in my head as you were describing the 3 different conjunctions without Saturn kind of leaving the room, so that we have this space for creating that new dynamic. But there's this idea in emergent strategy. Adrienne Marie Brown, here we go. Bingo. I've named her for the first time in this podcast. There's this idea that you cannot restore that which has been damaged. We have to move forward and transform. If we try to restore, we may never be able to get back to where we were, and that's not necessarily the point. And so the idea that first conjunction in April happens without Saturn, how do we not invite Saturn back to the table? Because that's not how we necessarily need to deal with cancel culture. But how do we move forward with Saturn into a new dynamic? How do we hold Saturn accountable still for the authority that it holds? Or how do we share more authority with Saturn? So if Saturn can kind of be that authority figure, literally leaving and coming back and then leaving again with, not lockstep, but closely conjoined this powerful Jupiter planet. I think there's a beautiful analogy to how we might think about where we want to take this idea of cancel culture. And then the other piece that I see, another dynamic that I see happening is we're getting the nodes crossing into new signs. So they're crossing from Capricorn and Cancer into Gemini and Sagittarius in early May. And so right at that right at the Saturn Pluto conjunction in January, that happens a couple days away from the last Cancer lunar eclipse. Then the last Cancer eclipse, it's a solar eclipse, happens in June, around the time of the second Jupiter Pluto conjunction. And so there's also this like dynamic of, all right, we're done with the Capricorn story for now. We'll revisit it later, but we're really kind of taking those pieces apart and moving on in both directions in the zodiac. And I do think that eclipse dynamic is interesting, where we'll begin to see a different dynamic. And now I'm going to take the time just to, as we talk about the nodes in Gemini and Saturn, I'll show these a beautiful, this is a Christmas gift my husband got me. And these are two candles. He didn't get them for me because the nodes are moving into those signs. I am a Gemini and a Saturn and a Sagittarius. But in honor of the node switching, I feel like I have to plug that.
Mm-hmm.
That's so light and lovely, and totally is a totally different vibe from what I wanted to go back to that you were talking about, which was Jupiter and Scorpio. Just that idea of cancel culture, Daniel, with when Jupiter was in Scorpio. I think a lot of what I've heard astrologers talking about with respect to Jupiter and Scorpio was the Me Too movement,
Mm-hmm.
and the collective realization in our culture, potentially just a realization for men, and a long coming realization that had already been had by so many women, that we need to believe women when or whoever is the victim of sexual violence. And Jupiter and Scorpio being concerned with bringing light to dark places like that. And I think there is a bit of an echo with Jupiter conjunct Pluto, not necessarily because Scorpio and Pluto could be related. No, nothing like that. I'm being sarcastic, obviously. I think they are related, and I think when Daniel was talking about Jupiter and Scorpio and cancel culture, it was just giving me this image of like holding something over somebody else. Like when there's a situation in life where you really feel like you got them, like you have something that you can hold over somebody else, and then they're going to have to behave how you have called them to behave because they wronged you. That's a very Scorpio dynamic, at least how I understand it. It's I have this thing that is yours, or it's an emanation of your action, and now I'm going to force you to act in such and such a way because of that. And I think this is a common thread between Jupiter and Scorpio, and Jupiter conjunct Pluto. So what would be a more Capricornian manifestation, or what would be a greater manifestation that we can, or a greater image that we can conjure in order to bring this Jupiter conjunct Pluto and Capricorn into reality? I think instead of holding something over somebody else's head, it might be, you think of Capricorn like bringing things down to earth. It's God coming to earth after domicile in Sagittarius, coming into a very earthbound Capricorn manifestation. What about holding out two hands, like cupping a truth in two hands and offering it? This is what I have to offer, rather than this is what I am doing as I hold something over. Something less threatening, less martial, and more, maybe Saturn and Aquarius, who's going to be ruling that first conjunction, as you both pointed out. So that's just something, like the imagery that was coming to mind with a Plutonic Jupiter. What are the dynamics of the atmosphere of truth at that time, and how can we be kinder to each other through them? I think that Jupiter in Capricorn has a great strength of being reserved through discovery. And that's something that I think we can all draw upon through this conjunction. Another thing that something that Michael was talking about was this idea of systems, of the Saturn Pluto, and going from the negation or the refusal or the rejection of systems of power, and then moving into the affirmation. And that was just making me think about some experiences that I've been having as the Saturn-Pluto conjunction has intensified, particularly in my day job, where there's just, I guess what I've been noticing is my attraction to the Cancer side of everything that's going on. As there have been so many systems crumbling in my work life, systems that are trying to be revamped, and then they fail. And when they fail, the relationship that has been constructed between people just doesn't exist anymore. Or it exists, but it exists in such a faulty way that we almost don't know how to interact. And there's like a searching for community in a more, I want to say visceral sense, compared to one that is abstracted into system, one that is more Cancerian rather than Capricornian. I have felt so at home with my coworkers as we've struggled through things together, and I've struggled to do the same with the people who I'm serving in my job, because there's so much tension, and there are expectations around how the system is supposed to function and what I'm supposed to be able to get from the system because I have followed the rules, which are these Capricorn themes. So I think as the nodes move, to get back to Daniel's point, as the nodes move from Cancer and Capricorn to Gemini and Sagittarius, I think that the Capricorn themes are going to become a little bit, they're going to lose some of the pressure that's been going on. To echo what Michael was saying about the pressure of Saturn Pluto, I think the nodes are so much a part of that. I think the pressure is going to reduce on the Capricorn themes, and there's going to be a greater emphasis on dynamics of sharing about the experience, because that's the Gemini Sagittarius. Like, what does this mean, rather than what do I need to feel safe? So those are just some of the thoughts that came up as you guys were chatting.
Yeah.
It's interesting that to think about that idea of Jupiter and Saturn both having their time with Pluto, and very separate, because Saturn literally leaves Capricorn to let Jupiter have its time with Pluto. But then when Jupiter and Saturn conjoin at the end of 2020, I know sneak peek ahead to December 2020, they do it not in Capricorn, but in Aquarius. And so I think there's this parallel to the transition point between Capricorn and Aquarius that I think of with Austin Coppock's 36 Faces, where the last 10 degrees of Capricorn are about, okay, we've accumulated this stuff. Now what? There's got to be more to this existence. What do we need to let go of to free up, to feel lighter, to be able to lift off? But then one of the things I love about Aquarius, I think a lot of people like to focus on the part of Aquarius that's like, yeah, cool, different, rad, hip. And yes, Aquarius certainly has its queer side in terms of it not necessarily the cool hip part, but the piece that is different from the norm. But in 36 faces, when you look at the 3 faces of Aquarius, it's not just about being different or being exiled because of who you are and how you're different from society. It's also about, with that perspective, how do you change society? How do you come back and how do you reintegrate into society, not in a assimilating sense, but in a sense that you are bringing the knowledge and wisdom that you have because of who you are and helping society understand the ways it needs to change. And I think that really reflects to me kind of what we're talking about in terms of cancel culture, or even in terms of, if we want to cancel our jobs or our bosses or the structures that are in power, how do we actually create change within an organization?
Mm-hmm.
That sometimes that requires leaving and letting other people do that change. Sometimes it requires staying, as long as it's healthy for you, and being able to really hold that organization accountable for that change. And I think we're going to see a lot of that happening in 2020. I also want to point out the reason that I think about Jupiter and Scorpio too. If you look at Jupiter and Pluto from the last time they conjoined around 12 years ago, and you look at, I've almost posted a blog about this several times, and you look at like the United States politics. That's the politics I know the most about. You see some very interesting themes come out and come to a head between when Jupiter's in Scorpio in 2016 and now in 2020, as we think about, stuff that might happen in 2020. And Drew, when you were talking about the Scorpio dynamic too, that just made me think of Nancy Pelosi and all of the pieces that are happening right now of like, everyone expected Nancy Pelosi to deliver the articles of impeachment. And she said, no, I have something and I'm going to play that card when and if I think it will actually be taken seriously. I have the power here. I will not succumb to pressure unless, and I wonder, it just made me curious. I wonder what Nancy Pelosi has in her chart. That is all.
Well, we could, should we go on a segue for that? I think that just not to delve too deeply into the media politics that's going on right now, but there is with Pluto some archetype of the monster or the monster, like some creature who is so I feel like any words that I say are just like immediately interpolated in this like weird way, so I don't want to go to, you know where I'm going with that. Saturn Pluto being like a rejection, like a Michael's language or the traditional language, a rejection or refusal or negation of the monster, which is so like no, we need to separate ourselves from this. It's that dry quality, versus a dry Jupiter in Capricorn, like finding the way forward, or the practical vision for what that manifestation means. What do we do now that we know that these beasts are? And when I say we, I should clarify that many have known that these beasts are there, but at a greater collective level, now that the beasts and the monsters are there, what does that demonstrate? The word monster actually comes from to demonstrate, because monsters show us things. Monsters teach us things about ourselves because we often project our own demons onto them. So I think that's something to consider as Jupiter conjoins Pluto as well. What is redeemable, or what movies are what movies are losing currency?
I love so much of what's being said right now. And as often happens when I'm listening to other people talk, I'm like, oh, that makes me think of a thing. So I'm going to try it. we've got to move on to other transits in 2020. But I'm going to share two references that came up for me as I was listening. First, when Drew was talking about the how is this showing up, and the move toward something else, like the more Cancerian side of things, as opposed to the all that's going on in Capricorn. And then Daniel, you also introduced or brought the word how. Like how do we shift from one thing to another? How do we occupy a different structure or a different approach or a different way of bringing wisdom back to the society? And I don't often reference Michel Foucault, but sometimes I do. And he wrote the introduction to Anti-Oedipus by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but there's two passages that feel like they relate directly to what we're talking about. So I'm just going to read them. Foucault wrote, "How does one keep from being fascist, even especially when one believes oneself to be a revolutionary? How do we rid our speech and our acts, our hearts and our pleasures of fascism? How do we ferret out the fascism that is ingrained in our behavior? Free political action from all unitary and totalizing paranoia. Develop action, thought, and desires by proliferation, juxtaposition, and disjunction, and not by subdivision and pyramidal hierarchization." And this is the part that I was thinking about in particular. "Withdraw allegiance from the old categories of the negative, the law, the limit, castration, lack, lacuna, which Western thought has so long held sacred as a form of power and an access to reality. Prefer instead what is positive and multiple, difference over uniformity, flows over unities, mobile arrangements over systems. Believe that what is productive is not sedentary, but nomadic." And he goes on along those themes, and a lot of those are very kind of Deleuzian concepts, the idea of the multiple and the positive and the elaboration and the proliferation of the flows. But it feels like that's part of the shift from Saturn, the negation of Saturn, to the positive proliferation of Jupiter, but also the shift that we could talk more about of Saturn moving from the old narratives, the old existing structures of Capricorn, to not something that's less structured, because of course Aquarius is a fixed sign. It's not radical freedom, whatever that means. But it is a devotion or an allegiance or a commitment to a new way or another way. And so that quote came to me. And then when you introduced the word monster, and I don't have this text at my fingertips, I can't just reach for it, but Susan Stryker, who's one of the pioneers and progenitors of transgender studies, one of her most influential essays is called "My Words to Victor Frankenstein," is the beginning of the title. I can't remember the second half of it, but she proposes occupying the category of the monster in a productive way. If transsexual people have been made monstrous, then what becomes possible to affirm that which is monstrous inside of us? And so if we read Pluto that way as a signifier of the monstrous, there is the refusal of some monsters, monsters of abuse, monsters of abduction and harm, but then also, what are the monsters that have been buried in the underworld, those that have been repressed or repressed or marginalized? Who are the monsters that are here, as you said, to show us something? So there's something about the affirmation of the monstrous as well, as the rejection of some monsters, and then the affirmations of others feels like it's in there too.
I just think too about the idea that is held by so many that there is a monster in the White House right now. And this idea that if we could just get rid of the monster,
only it were that simple.
Yeah, that removal from office would be the thing. And I think there's a lot of people who have not given up their power, but utilized power in the old ways to, elect new people in the midterm elections that have the agenda of impeachment. And that has now come to fruition. And some are arguing will result in no change. And so there is this idea that what monster are we being seen? What monster do we need to pay attention to? And is that monster a single leader? Is that monster a system that we have built? And how does our new awareness of that system allow us to take collective action? And I love the piece that you read by Foucault, because I think that speaks to how one could use their power without resorting to the methods of power that's already established for representative democracy. Because I think a lot of people deal with that feeling of, what can I do where I am? What can I do about this huge issue that we're facing as a nation? Nothing. I'm one person. And that is so not true.
It's not true.
You're
not one person.
There's also... Yeah, I was talking about this at Brian Alamana is an astrologer in Chicago who I hang out with at his astrology salons. And we were talking about the nodes current in transit. And I was like, what I'm doing right here is how I understand my manifestation of a Cancer North node transit, as opposed to everything going on in Capricorn. Like, we were all sitting around talking about, the mundane astrology and Saturn Pluto and everything that was going on politically. And nobody was really that up on what was happening politically. Like, we all knew that impeachment was happening, and we all knew that things were messed up, and nothing was probably going to happen because of the Senate, whatever. And there was a lot of anxiety around that, around nothing happening. And so then the question became, okay, well, what can we do about this? And I thought that the answer was exactly where we were. We were in a small community, a nurturing community of people, face to face, not abstracted into system, and just sitting around and talking about belonging to something greater, which, Cancer is my 9th house, so that's at least my experience of Cancer. So I think there really is a draw to that Cancer side. I've went on my own tangent there. I totally forget where this came from. Otherwise, I would put it in better context.
You're responding to that you're not just one person who can't do anything. It's how do we do it? Well, we do it in our tangible, real, personal lives. Yeah. And part of what I also love that you illustrated in that anecdote about the salon is that we're never in isolation. We're actually it's true. You can't do anything on your own as one person, but you're not on your own as one person, in the same way that the monster in the White House is not one person. That's part of what I think Foucault is getting at in that passage, is a rejection of the totality and the unitary. That's not, from my view, that's not reality, but that's also the old way of understanding. So then how do we exercise power in a different way? Well, we gather in collectives, we connect across intimate relations, we create new systems of meaning in practice with one another, rather than trying to implement or impose a new dominant system of meaning. That's not the way. I think that's part of what it means to root out every trace of fascism from our own behavior, is to start to question, where am I still participating in that old model, in that old system? I have so many other thoughts about that relate to education, but we should probably talk about another transit, right?
I'll just wrap up this one by saying, if you need a way to visualize in a story and an escape what we've been talking about, go see Star Wars Episode 9.
Do I have to see any of the others before that one?
Nope.
Okay.
You need to know probably the some of the history of the universe.
I mean, I saw the first three of growing up, like a
Yeah.
lot of times.
Yeah.
And then I saw the whichever one was bad. The
The third.
There are multiple.
the one with with Jar Jar Binks in it.
There are multiple.
That one was not good.
With Jar Jar Binks, unfortunately. But yes, episode 9 is all about that idea of we are not alone, and that is all I will say to not give spoilers. But I thought for the problems that I thought the film had, that message was so resonant and so beautiful, and so satisfyingly tackled, in my opinion, that go see it. What should we talk about next? We can go semi-chronologically and talk about Mercury retrogrades real quickly. That should be
I'd
a short
love to
one.
hear about Mercury retrogrades. Let's go.
Go for it.
So the Mercury retrogrades happening in 2020. The first one begins in February and ends in March. The middle one is June, July, and the last one is September, October into November a little bit. Last year we saw largely Mercury retrogrades in water signs. This year we see what I call bubbly water. They are right on the border of air and water signs. And it's really cool to see some of that playing out, I will say. So the first one in February starts in Aquarius with the shadow of the retrograde and goes into Pisces, and then Mercury retrogrades back into Aquarius and then out of Pisces by the end of March. So it does take about 2 months to complete that whole cycle if you count the shadows. And the thing about Pisces is Mercury does not like Pisces. Mercury is fallen and in detriment in Pisces. And so if you remember back to the February-March 2019 retrograde, that one was one of the crunchiest for a lot of people partially because of that element. This one is not as crunchy in terms of the aspects that happen. So there's a ton of Uranus all year long with these Mercury retrogrades. And this one is coming right after Mercury squares Uranus in mid-January. So Mercury squaring Uranus, to me, is really about a situation that you are being forced to deal with in your life relating to Taurus, relating to that Uranian transit. And you can ignore that, right? I was talking to someone about this idea between free will and fate. If we think about what astrology tells us, that might be the terrain that we see in front of us. We can still pick which direction to go in. But if we instead tackle that square with Uranus mid-January, we might be in a better position to deal with Uranus throughout these retrogrades. Mercury sextiles Uranus 3 times in this Pisces retrograde in February, March. And we see that same signature come back on the other side of Taurus when Mercury's in Cancer. So that's that second retrograde in June and July. And in Cancer, Mercury squares Mars, which is just transitioned into Aries at that point. So there's a little bit of Mars is following through on the promise of that square and following through with, nope, there's an action that needs to happen in your life. There's a change you need to listen to. There's a call you need to heed. And let's try Cancer if that needs to be the case. I don't know. I've just started kind of paying more attention to the Mercury retrogrades, and for me, they felt connected this year. And so I'm interested to see how that story goes. But also, again, they're all connected with Uranus. And so that felt to me like the through line in 2020. And those are the only aspects Mercury makes, which also kind of highlights the intensity of those aspects. Because then in September, October, November, when we get the last Mercury retrograde of 2020 in Libra and Scorpio, we are seeing Mercury opposing that Uranus element. And so there's this fresh perspective or awareness on on that element. And we also see when Mercury is in Libra, we see it opposing Mars, which it squared a few months prior. So it's that opposition aspect is really about awareness, and being on the other side of things and being able to make a different perspective. We also get Mercury, when Mercury's in that fall retrograde, we get a sextile with Venus. So there is some support there, but we also get a square with Saturn in Capricorn. And so we might have some more perspective on exactly what's limiting us, what's been limiting us throughout the year. And that thing about bubbly water is like when you shake it, the bubbles come and then over time they get flat again. And so I feel like the flat retrograde, or the one that might feel like it's taking forever, I feel like is the mid-year one, the one in June and July. And then the one that gets fizzy again, where we get reintroduced to the air sign when Mercury's in Libra, is that fall retrograde. And I think that one's going to have the most effervescence in terms of we're either going to see the most action from that retrograde, or we are going to have the clearest sight moving forward. So we know exactly what we need to tackle in the areas that Mercury is bringing to light in our charts.
I love that breakdown. Did I cut you off before saying something?
No, I was just going to say, I think that Mercury retrogrades always feel to me like they're over exaggerated dramatic. And I think they can be I think they're calls to action. I think if you're ignoring the call, or you're too worried about what the call is and you're not being present during that time to actually listen to what's happening as Mercury's going back and forth, I think you might miss that message. And so I think it's something to check in on, not to worry about any of these, but to check in on them once they're happening and reflect and say, oh yeah, that's right. This is going to feel a little bubbly. Or this one will feel a little flat, but there's some effervescence coming in the fall.
I think that call to action theme that you just mentioned is really apt for the theme that you're pointing to, with these retrogrades tying in very closely with Mars and Uranus. The first one you mentioned being, especially the one in July being square to Mars, and then there was a Uranus aspect in the first one and a Uranus aspect in the last one, right?
And in the middle one too.
Oh, and there's a sextile in the middle one, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that definitely feels like needing to do something. And it's interesting because all of the Mercury retrogrades, except for the one in Pisces this year, also had something going on with that, because we had the Mercury conjunct Mars at the beginning of Leo, square Uranus, and then we had Mercury retrograde, which was ruled by Mars, then Mars joined and opposed Uranus this year. So that's like a lot of consecutive Mercury retrogrades to be having Mars and Uranus in them, and I think that's a really smart point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the only thing I would add, because I think that was really thorough, is that Mercury will conjoin Uranus on May 1st, and so there's, for me, because if I look at those transits within the larger cycle, then there's that conjunction is splitting the first and second retrograde. So the first retrograde may be more related to the previous year's relationship to Uranus and the Uranus story that's been unfolding for a couple of years now, and then the second and third retrograde being on the waxing and then opposing side of that cycle feels like, just checking in with that Uranus story. I love that you brought that forward as a thread that connects all three of those retrogrades. That's not something that I had noticed. And so just thinking about where does the conjunction fall in between those retrogrades feels like part of the story that's going to be unfolding there. I like the idea of the call to action. It's not where I first go with a retrograde. My instinct is like slow down, take time, reflect, review. And so I guess all I would add from my perspective is that if there's a call to action, it might be a delayed call. Here are ways to come into some sort of process of reflection on what you do and do not understand, what is and is not clear, so that you might then act, so that there is a call, so that the call to action is not necessarily, the action itself is not lined up with those retrogrades, as much as the retrogrades are teaching you something about how one might act. And as specifically, if we relate it to the Uranus cycle, how a call to act differently, which I guess is sort of implicit in all change in some way, but to that there's something being broken up, there's new space being made, and that there's something different to be said and done about that. I think that's all I have to add on the Mercury retrogrades.
I feel like as a Sagittarius, I should say, we do think before we act. It's just really fast. But I love that distinction about it isn't the call to act now, but it is the okay, I'm going to use another movie reference because I've just loved some of the movies. Frozen 2. It is the song that Elsa hears before she decides to go into the unknown.
Mm.
And so it's listening to that call and deciding to pay attention to it that I feel like is the real power in that Mercury retrograde cycle. I love too, Michael, that you say that the conjunction happens there too. And it makes me think about the important role that Mercury's playing this summer, related to kind of supervising Venus's retrograde in Gemini. And so before we get into the retrograde, I just want to remark that Mercury being conjoined at that time is right in the middle of that retrograde. And so if Mercury has anything to say about retrogrades this year of its own, it also can speak to the retrograde that Venus is going through. And I think we'll see an important connection between those two stories in May.
Totally. I mean, it's so interesting the way that plays out. Like Mercury ingresses into Gemini on the day that Venus stations retrograde. And prior to that, they've been exchanging signs. So they're definitely related to each other that whole time. And then Mercury swoops in to rule the entire retrograde, but actually goes through really fast. I think the biggest thing that jumps out to me about the retrograde is that it is, the Venus retrograde is that at the stationary retrograde degree, Venus receives an overcoming square from Neptune. And an overcoming square basically just means that the aspect is coming from the right. So whichever, like if you can imagine Venus at the top of a chart wheel, this aspect is coming from the right side of that wheel from Neptune in Pisces, which is thought to be a more like the more authoritative position in terms of describing sort of just who's in power, in terms of which planet's in power. So with Neptune being in this superior position for the retrograde, and Venus retrograde already being a little bit about renegotiating relational dynamics, then Neptune being thrown in there might even grasp for what the dynamics are to begin with. Maybe some confusion around who has what. I mean, this is happening in my 8th house, so I'm already reading my own chart for this. What do y'all think about the Neptune dynamic of this? I know we talked about, I remember when Venus was in Sagittarius and this square happened, we were talking about like dreams for love, but also possibly the danger in I remember, Michael, it was something about boundaries in love.
Yeah.
Because Jupiter at the time was in Sagittarius, so it was this expansive feeling, and now it's in Gemini, so maybe Mercury is having a strong say over this. So there's a feeling of pointing to exactly what things belong where, but possibly in a way that opens us up to the possibility for harmony, a harmony that might not even be possible, but is it's in the air, so you act as if it's possible. That's how I would read the Neptune piece, being in a Gemini, being in a Mercury sign, but such a strong Neptune influence for this retrograde.
Yeah, I mean, most times, if Neptune is in hard aspect to something, the question of solidity or boundaries is going to come up for me. In hard aspect to Venus, boundaries in love boundaries in relationship does feel important. So then the Mercury Gemini piece is what needs to be said in order to maintain or establish boundaries that allow us to stay in our integrity and meet one another with care. That said, because it's a retrograde and there's Neptune's influence, my gut instinct, and I'm spinning this as in the moment. This isn't something that I'd thought much about ahead of time. It seems something like Mercury is definitely there to help say what needs to be said in this situation. But my instinct is that perhaps it's not clear what situation we're in. As long as Venus is retrograde, square Neptune, we may actually be interacting mostly with our projections, mostly with our fantasies, or even our ideals as to what we want the situation to be, or what we fear the situation to be, either what sort of in any direction, that the situation itself may not be clear. And so then trying to find what are the words that need to be said, what are the things that need to be addressed inside the situation, may not happen smoothly, because it's possible that we're operating within a misunderstanding, a misapprehension of what the situation actually is.
Yeah, I think the other thing that's happening there is that Mercury whips through Gemini this year. So as opposed to this retrograde theme that we were just talking about, of like slowing down and finding a space of reflection for the actions to come, when Mercury is moving fast like this, it is like do this, do that. So I wonder if people's experience around that time will be, obviously it'll depend on the chart, but it seems like Venus is moving really slow and Mercury is moving really fast. So the communication is happening around the Venus themes with Mercury ruling the retrograde, but the relational juices are just not really there. Or they're there way too much because it's Neptune. So I wonder if that's just going to be a little bit of a dicey retrograde, with a lot said, but not really rooted in reality. Yeah,
I think about
a while with like, yeah, it's not the most fun retrograde, but I don't know what maybe we could ask people to pull out of it.
Ugh, patience.
so.
Daniel?
Oh, I was as Michael, you were talking, I kept just thinking about salt. Salt being the ingredient that separates Neptune from any water sign. If we talk about like Neptune as the ocean, an ocean is salty. And when we talk about salt in water, the taste is gross. Well, you might disagree. Everyone's to their own opinion. I don't like salt. I don't like salty water in my mouth. However, an interesting property of salty water is it does lift you better. It creates a certain buoyancy. And so as I'm looking at the dates and the aspects that Venus is making, we see very early on in the retrograde cycle, before Venus even stations, early May, there is that square with Neptune. That might be where we first taste the salt. Then on the 20th of May, we get the second square when Venus is retrograde, short and very close to Mercury being at that same degree. And so that might be where we first exclaim that we taste the salt. And then an interesting part of that cycle of the retrograde is the cazimi, when Venus goes in the heart of the sun. And that's happening the day after the square with Mars in Pisces. And so I think that's a piece that feels the way I imagine salt to taste in some sense. And so I think we don't feel the buoyancy or the potential buoyancy until Venus is already direct and going through the shadow again, when it squares Jupiter, or when it squares Neptune one more time in late July. So I do think it asks us to sit with those feelings and sit with those expressions, and determine what we might think about separating from, but not to make those final decisions until we have kind of cleared the shadow. I think we will continue to feel like we're floating, but not understand what the floating is about until we're kind of beyond that. But then I do think that there's more in store for Venus that's not as salty. And I think that getting some distance away from that time could be what helps us integrate those lessons.
That's a great point with the square, like the cazimi being square Mars. That's very spicy. What I notice with, like, when I read for people who have that square, especially in mutable signs, there's like, it's kind of a like, what do I want aspect. Like, I want it to be this way. Like, I want it to be soft, but I also want it to be rough. But I like this part about them, but that part about them isn't great. Like, how can I check all the boxes? Like, Venus square Mars just has this like tension of like, I can't have everything. So maybe that's one of the lessons of this retrograde, with that being the cazimi point and having that square to Mars, is, Gemini like wants to try all the things. Maybe the Mars square is a little bit of a reality check, even though it's in Pisces. A Pisces reality check on what, like, it's just not possible. Like, you're not going to get all the things that you want. I think maybe that's, and maybe there is something buoyant in that that can be uplifting going forward.
I don't know, but I just realized that's my chart. A Mars Venus square in Pisces and Gemini.
Sign based, baby. Don't worry.
I'm not worried. I'm saying, let me tell you in June how that goes for me, and we will nail that signification. Because my Venus is also natally retrograde. Wait, and I'll be 32. Yeah, so that makes sense. Wow, math.
Wait, what's the 32 part have to do with that?
Multiple of 8, so Venus return.
Yes.
Oh.
Same. Oh my gosh, wait, we were born in the same Venus retrograde cycle, Daniel. I didn't notice that.
And a 9th house perfection year. I don't know what that means for you, but I had one thought on something that Drew said, like Gemini wants to try all the things. And that might be true. I also think that Gemini wants to say all the things. And that I'm still pondering the speed question that you brought forward of Mercury whipping through Gemini while Venus is going through this very slow and deliberate process. And so in terms of like what people might synthesize from this in terms of preparing for the year ahead, it seems like whatever our apprehension of reality of what's actually happening in this relationship, what we actually want, what we maybe can't have, that the words are going to try to get ahead of perception and understanding and clear communication. And so that's why my knee-jerk reaction was like patience, but specifically slow down the words, because the words are going to want to bubble out. And we're going to want to say all the things that we want, and we're going to want to say all the things that we are rejecting or deal breakers. Like, no, you can't be that way, or no, you can't do that. Like, all the things are going to want to be said, but we don't actually have all the information that we need in order to say what it is that needs to be said. That feels like part of how I would understand the Gemini component of that situation, especially square Neptune, that the illusion or delusion is going to be challenging. Yeah.
Maybe there's a Saturn and Aquarius trine situation that can help there. Like by that time, Saturn is in Aquarius, so when Mercury first ingresses into Gemini on May 12th, it's going to immediately trine Saturn in Aquarius. So maybe that moment, if you're somebody who uses astrology to prepare for what that whole Venus retrograde is going to be, maybe there is a sort of, I don't know, just boundary that you can set with yourself around what you will or won't say, because a trine to Saturn in Aquarius, where both planets are in dignity, sounds like a great moment to ritualize something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to propose an alternative interpretation of that Venus retrograde as well. I think we all love to think about Venus as the lovely relationship planet.
We really should have like 5 million interpretations of this retrograde.
Indeed, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Another big one that I think of is money. And so the idea that we may be interested in trying to have many income streams, or trying to activate certain resources, or otherwise be attractive during that time. We may not feel that. We may feel that saltiness. And I think that invitation to slow down and really be present with that is an important part of understanding where you might invest, or where you might spend more of your time, in order to provide something that's more long-term and something that's not quite so splintered. Mercury at its worst, or Gemini at its worst, is splintered. At its best is being able to juggle many things at once. But you don't learn to juggle by starting with 4 or 5 balls. You need to start slow and build up to that.
That's great.
Yeah, bringing in money and value, that's definitely, that's totally Venus. Or even like presentation, like how you present yourself aesthetically.
Totally.
Great time for trying out different kinds, like if you're somebody who's genderqueer, like maybe playing around with that.
Or if you're someone who's not genderqueer, maybe playing around with that.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, actually, I mean, the one thought I had in response to what Daniel just said, because it was brilliant, was between aesthetic presentation and money streams is like branding. Like, how are you branding what you're doing? And maybe that could be depending on where that shows up in your chart, which is something that we've kind of casually referenced a couple of times. I don't think we said it explicitly. Like, at least from my view, everything we're saying has to defer back to a person's chart. Maybe that goes without saying. My observations on Twitter and Instagram is that doesn't go without saying, so it's worth saying it. But particularly if Gemini is related to 10th house or 2nd house, or even 6th house stuff, then the question of using that Venus retrograde to clarify your branding could be an important way of using that cycle.
Yeah, or even 9th or 3rd house if it's something that you're like long or short works that you're publishing. I think a lot about branding with like Instagram. That to me feels very 3rd house. But as we were also remarking, I don't have my copy of Emergent Strategy here.
I have mine.
But even like we were noticing, like, hey, Adrienne Marie Brown uses similar colors in these book covers. That's branding. And that's more 9th house branding.
Oh my God, you have Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition right next to you.
I thought it was just such a great foil for you to
Yeah. It's good to bring in Adrienne Marie Brown and Hannah Arendt all in the same space. Who else could I grab? No, whatever. I have like 47 books within arm's reach.
That's Venus and Gemini.
That's just Moon and Gemini.
Who else should I grab?
Yeah, did we feel like we said what we needed to say about Venus retrograde?
Well, this might be a good place to transition. Like, there's an eclipse at 0 degrees Cancer right at the end of, oh, wait, is that true? Yeah, right at the end of the retrograde period. So that's one direction we could go. And also just to say that, like, Venus is in Gemini for 4 months. So buckle down for some slow fun.
Honestly, talk to me about it. I love it. It's beautiful. I've got that in my chart. I'll tell you about it.
Oh yeah.
For 4
Yeah,
months.
I mean, there's what do we have left? We have the eclipse. We have I never know what to say about eclipses, honestly, because they're just so like big.
Well, I think that summer eclipse is exciting for 2 reasons. We've got 3 eclipses during the summer, and there might be some grumblings about like those far away ones don't really count. They will be talked about in the media. But I think it's interesting because we've got one of them in Cancer and one of them in Capricorn. But then we've got our first eclipse that's outside of the Cancer-Capricorn axis with that Sagittarius lunar eclipse in mid-June. And I don't know what I want to say necessarily about those eclipses other than I think there's that sweet spot of like being able to end one nodal axis and enter a new one. So we might see some dynamic new themes start to emerge. I feel like it's not until the end of the year when we get the proper, all the eclipses in that season in the same axis where we're really going to start to see some motion there. But I don't know. I think personally, I will be glad to move on from the Cancer Capricorn axis, although I might eat my words because my 1st and 7th house are going to be this next one. So be careful
happy.
What you wish for.
I was very, very happy when eclipses left my angular houses. Totally. Like, just because so much happens when eclipses are transiting. To be fair, I've only been following my transits during 2 like pairs of eclipses happening, like 10th 4th and 9th 3rd. The 10th 4th ones were super, super malefic for me, and the 9th 3rd ones have been like very busy and like hard, not easy by any stretch, but I think eclipses just bring so much activity to where they're pinging off. So if you have those going into an angular house, like that's some real shit, you know?
And I've got half my chart in those houses.
Yes, you do.
So honestly, 2020, I didn't realize this till I started talking about it with y'all. 2020 is just about Daniel. So my life is just like a model for how we should live through these transits. JK.
Well, I mean, that can be your branding. You can pull that out during Venus retrograde, like life told by Daniel through 1st 7th house eclipses. Do it. Blog post.
I'm just gonna like wear a GoPro and live stream that entire month.
Sometimes I wish I did that just so that I could like go back to my transits and like see what was actually happening, because I don't journal or anything. I don't record my experiences in any of these ways that would help looking back. But wait, sorry, we were talking about eclipses. Anything else? Oh, the 0 degree one is on a super cardinal point, so that one will probably be big for like mundane things. 0 Cancer for an eclipse right on the nodes. Hello.
Yeah. I don't have much to add about eclipses. I don't work with them very often because there's so much inconsistency in the tradition as to what they mean and how to use them. One of my favorite sources on eclipses, well, I'll reference 2 things. One, I really like Lisa Scheim and Chris Brennan did an episode on eclipses this past summer, and just nicely summarized like that the house where the eclipse is taking place could describe a dramatic ending or a dramatic beginning, depending on whether it's a solar eclipse, which is a new moon, or a lunar eclipse, which is a full moon. Just look for dramatic endings and beginnings in the houses where they fall. And that feels like a very, very broad application, but at least it's a way of making meaning. I mean, I think some of the oldest omenology around eclipses is like, we should be terrified. These are harbingers of doom. And maybe that's not the approach that I want to use with eclipses. The one that I've been experimenting with the last couple of years comes from Bernadette Brady, where she situates specifically the solar eclipses within the Saros series, so that each eclipse falls within a family of eclipses that over hundreds, sometimes thousands of years, spiral down from the North Pole to the South Pole, or from the South Pole to the North Pole. And because astrology is astrology is predicated on the fact that we can know something about how things unfold based on its starting point, she looks at the initial eclipse within each Saros series as a way of getting some sense of the particular qualities, that it's not just any eclipse, it's an eclipse that belongs to this particular family. And the one on June 21st belongs to Ceres 4 North. And some of the keywords that she offers for it based on the chart for the initial one. The initial eclipse was in 1389 in that series. Restriction, inhibition, restraint, separation, events can occur which seem to block the individual. In this blocking, the individual is very prone to misjudge their strengths or the situation, and is best advised to wait until the eclipse passes before taking any real action. And maybe that's like my general advice for most eclipses: wait until after the eclipse happens to take any action. But yeah, there's something useful about situating it in a Ceres series, just to give like, what's the broader context of each eclipse is not just a bomb going off in some part of our life multiple times a year. Like, that's not a sustainable way of understanding the relationship between the sky and the earth, I think. But if that works for folks, then by all means. I just think there's something, as I said, I actually said a lot for saying that I don't have much to say about eclipses. I guess what I'm expressing is my ambivalence, that I don't have a single clear utility for eclipses in my practice. But Bernadette Brady's Predictive Astrology, The Eagle and the Lark, is a good resource if you're trying to map how to begin to think of eclipses as part of much larger cycles.
I love that. And I would add that I think that resource I've seen especially useful for if the eclipse is within 3 degrees of a planet or a point in your chart. Then that individual interpretation might feel more strong, even though the eclipses in your house will activate something, even if it's weak, is kind of how I go off of that interpretation. Also, since it's the year of Daniel, I just want to point out that eclipse is on opposite my natal Saturn within 1 degree.
Wow.
So again, I'll let you know how that goes, the individual feeling blocked business.
Last night's eclipse was exactly conjunct my natal Jupiter. I haven't yet made. Oh no, that's not true. Last night. Oh no, it's the conjunction in January. That's exactly conjunct my natal Jupiter. That's what's happening. Last night's eclipse was conjunct my Neptune, but that's not I don't have a lot to say about them.
It's funny that we're recording this right now.
Yeah.
Talking about Neptune so much.
We talk
Where
about
should we go next?
Well, I think it's so interesting in July where we get this like triple retrograde handoff. I had to say that in the monster truck rally voice. We get the end of that middle of the year Mercury retrograde. Venus finally exits the shadow, and Mars enters the shadow of the retrograde.
And
so
they sextile, which is kind of fun. I don't know.
Yeah. Maybe that's where we go next, into Aries. For the rest of 2020.
Yeah, it's a long time. It's almost 6 months.
So as a Mars and Aries native, I'm both exhilarated and terrified of the last 6 months of the year, because Mars and Aries is just like, there's so much energy there, but the fact that it's going to be for so long, I wonder if there's kind of a burnout danger for people.
It's trying to be Jupiter in Sagittarius.
Yeah, literally, like Mars will be in Aries for about half the time that Jupiter was in Sagittarius, which is kind of wild to think about. And I think part of that's because the retrograde degrees at 28 degrees, so it spends like, it's at the very end of the sign. I think this retrograde, well, this isn't quite in the retrograde shadow yet when this happens, but when Mars goes into Aries, it will apply to Chiron as Chiron stations retrograde at 9 degrees. And I think these two archetypes are really interesting together. I've started working with Chiron a little bit more lately. I don't want to pretend like I'm an expert. The words that you hear thrown around about Chiron are the wounded healer. I also hear teacher. I also think about I learned this on Melanie Gurley's podcast, the Beautiful Astrology podcast. I forget who the guest was who discussed this, but the idea that Chiron is the body who unites the orbits of Saturn and Uranus. So Chiron has an elliptical orbit uniting the visible and the invisible. So there's a theme of synchronicity and things coming from outside that kind of show you the way toward a greater wholeness, I suppose. So with Chiron and Mars, like we have a very initiatory energy in Aries, and Chiron kind of breaking down I almost want to say breaking down the maleness of Mars or the virility of Mars into something that is more instructive, or not that maleness cannot be instructive, but is a little bit more self-aware of a Mars, especially because Chiron is turning retrograde at that time. There's this interesting fusing of those two. Do either of you have thoughts on Chiron and Mars at this moment, or should we go to a different part of that? Okay, that's the beginning of the Mars and Aries story, and I just love that it's at that they conjoin as Chiron stations retrograde, so it feels important. Mars squares Jupiter on August 2nd at the same moment that Mercury opposes Saturn from Cancer to Capricorn. So there's like all of this cardinal energy happening, and this is just after Mars has entered shadow. Just kind of the broad strokes here. Then Mars stations retrograde on September 9th, and then direct on November 13th. So there's a whole lot of Mars and Aries, and obviously it's going to get all those squares from all the Capricorn stuff. It's a lot of Mars and Aries, and it's a lot of cardinal energy all fall. What do we think?
Yeah, I was paying attention to those squares, especially because there's just so many of them. During the shadow, Mars literally squares Mercury, Jupiter, Pluto, Saturn, Venus. And then the persistent squares that happen during the retrograde are those Capricorn ones of Saturn, Pluto, and Jupiter. But then the fun thing is when Mars stations direct and then it leaves its shadow in the beginning of January 2021, it only squares Pluto in Capricorn, because by that time Saturn and Jupiter have left into Aquarius together, holding hands. And so for me, I almost think this retrograde cycle isn't going to feel fully completed until we see the square from Aquarius to Mars in Taurus in mid-January. And that is when Mars is conjoining Uranus at 6 degrees of Taurus. And so there's this feeling for me that's like, we might feel like, okay, we've had enough of this. Isn't it over yet? And I feel like it's still going to be sprinkling into early 2021. And just the incredible, we haven't talked fully about that Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, but just that incredible connection to this larger Uranus story. And then this new Aquarius story that is emerging, to me feels really important as we think about that Mars retrograde ending.
I mean, my thoughts on Mars retrograde in Aries are mostly about struggle and freedom. I'm thinking about Aries as, I think all the fire signs in different ways for me relate to an impulse towards freedom, the ability to take action, to move forward in different ways. And Mars is not afraid of a fight. Mars in Aries especially is capable of confrontation, of pursuing desire, even if it results in conflict. And so then what does it mean for that impulse to turn retrograde? So I'm thinking about the question, what are you fighting for? What are you willing to struggle? And I keep thinking about Angela Davis teaching us that freedom is a constant struggle, which is actually a line that she is quoting from a freedom song that was sung in the 20th century freedom movement, civil rights movement in the United States. And part of what I've taken her to mean, or I guess part of how I understand that as I meditate on that for years now, for what does it mean for freedom to be a constant struggle, is that struggling against existing systems of oppression, domination, exploitation, and harm is part of what it means to be free. Freedom is in part the freedom to struggle, the insistence on struggle as part of what it means to insist on freedom. I think we often take freedom to mean something like, I can do whatever I want. And I think that within the current conditions of our world, by which I mean like imperialist, colonialist, white supremacist, capitalist, heteropatriarchy, if you're free to do whatever you want, you're probably acting in alignment with or complicit with systems of oppression that want you to be complacent in some way. Like if your action, if your behavior is so unbridled, then it's because it's consistent with the existing structures of power. And so what does it mean to struggle? What does it mean? What is it that we're fighting for? Mars retrograde in Aries feels like a good time to be asking that question. It also seems like it's has the potential to bring us back to struggles or battles that we thought we were done with. What were things we've fought for in the past, and how are those coming back in a way that's not so dissimilar from when Venus has a retrograde, people are like, oh, expect the DMs from your exes. Like in a similar way, this Mars retrograde, especially in Aries, feels like the things that have previously challenged our ability to survive may come up again. That story may not be done, or it may be that we have to return to that site of struggle in some meaningful way during this retrograde, especially because of the ways that, as Daniel pointed out, this sort of full cycle resolves with that conjunction to Uranus. That breakaway feels like part of what's coming out of this cycle.
Well, and I just recall the last time Mars was retrograde was in Capricorn and Aquarius. And so if we think about how are the ways that we have learned from those signs and Mars' struggle in those signs, what have we learned that helps us keep that fighting alive, that resistance alive? And especially with all those squares to Capricorn and then Aquarius, it really, I think, hits home the idea of that forward momentum, even as we think about retrograde as backward movement. One of the really great ways that we keep resistance alive is lineage. And that idea that, Michael, your post on Twitter was amazing. Just about...
What are we talking about?
Which one?
What did I say?
Just about that idea of whether or not we always recognize marginalized groups, they exist.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And especially, I think you were talking in terms of queer people.
Yeah.
And I think about that idea of being able to tap into both a physical lineage or a historically passed down lineage, but also a lineage of existence, of a part of human nature that is, you can try to oppress it and it will come back. It is, I think, a part of that idea for me when I think about the connection between Mars retrograde cycles.
I don't know if this was intentional, but I hear a lot of language coming through about the Capricorn stuff going on, in terms of like, what am I struggling for? Like that idea, but not to say that Mars in Aries is not concerned with purpose, but the purpose of Mars in Aries is much more instinctual and less planned than the Capricorn influences that are happening, and those Capricorn ones with both Jupiter and Saturn and Pluto feel much more about a purpose with a greater at a purpose at a greater scale. And when Michael was bringing in civil rights movements in, I assume you were referencing the 50s and 60s, Michael?
Yeah, 20th century throughout. Yeah.
Or yeah. So actually the last Jupiter-Saturn conjunction that took place in Capricorn was in 1961, February 18th to be exact, at 25 Capricorn. So I wonder if there are extra lessons to be brought forward from that time in the context of this a Mars in Aries that has to do with struggle, or freedom relating to struggle, since this Capricorn stuff is recalling that period of time.
Yeah, definitely recalling that historical period, but then also because of the squares to Pluto, that whatever it is that Saturn has said no to, and whatever it is that Jupiter is in a process of saying yes to, Mars is having to deal with that. Refusal and affirmation require struggle. It's not simply a mindset. There's action to be taken, action that requires us to behave differently. And I think maybe that's one of the ways in which I would distinguish. I'm definitely drawing a connection between the Capricorn and the Aries narratives, but also the Aries feels like it's we have to deal with ourselves in our own place within this. Mm-hmm. What is it that I am struggling for? Aries has this individuating impulse, like whether or not it's on axis with Libra. So like, as opposed to let's all go together, Aries is more inclined to like, I'm going my way no matter what. And this retrograde feels like potentially an invitation to reconsider or even challenge that individualism. This is a new thought. How does my examination of how I act on and struggle for my quote unquote individual desires relate to the systemic shifts that we are both refusing and affirming? That it's not enough to simply it's not enough to only address it at a systemic level. We also have to be willing to turn inward, retrograde. We have to be able to turn inward and examine our own behaviors in relation to those larger systemic shifts. I think that's what I'm trying to point to. And yeah, and that the historical precedent, I was bringing in the civil rights movement, the freedom movement, because of that phrase, freedom is a constant struggle, that it comes from that period. And that's where Angela Davis is drawing that wisdom from. But I do think it's instructive as well that it's not enough to only be involved in movement at a systemic level, that we have to be at that personal and interpersonal level as well.
Well, there's a reckoning that's happening during the last half of 2020 as we experience this Mars retrograde. We have been questioning for years, what are people thinking when they go to the polls? And that's definitely going to be top of our minds by the time Mars stations retrograde, even if it isn't top of our minds by the time it enters the shadow of the retrograde in late July. But I do think it's interesting that right around Election Day, we get that last square to Jupiter, and then an opposition to Venus in Libra. And that idea of what are our personal responsibilities in resistance, and are we just playing into these systemic things that are replicating, or are there actions that we're taking that are more local? How do we actually influence a vote? Is it by casting our votes as individuals, or is it by the rhetoric that we use surrounding or around that time when people are considering especially those that might be on the fence, considering how to cast their votes. I always fantasize about like the lazy, not actually going to the polls on election day, but like really going hard to make sure that people around me voted for my candidate. I vote, don't worry.
Thanks.
It's not a real fantasy, because I realize if everyone did that, it wouldn't work. But it's that idea that I view my own influence and my local influence as more powerful than a single vote that I can cast. And it's that I think it's that dynamic that we need to leverage in addition to voting, that we might actually understand how we might shift things towards a more supportive environment for continued resistance.
Well said. Yeah, and I mean, I definitely, I 100% agree that there's power to be exercised at scales other than federal elections, and that's actually part of how we practice and invent new systems. And also, I have basically no patience left for the rhetoric of, well, this is a broken system, so I'm not going to participate anymore. I think that's often a profoundly privileged position. And if you need some more developed language and thought than we're going to be able to get into on this podcast, Toshi Reagan broke it down beautifully on how to survive the end of the world with Adrienne Maree Brown and Autumn Brown. I don't remember what episode it was, but if you want to go back and listen to that, we actually have a responsibility not only to ourselves, but also those who are most marginalized. And also, she specifically brought up youth. We have a responsibility to vote for those who are so disillusioned and that they can't or they won't vote. And it's actually like our responsibility to make sure that the worst possible scenario is not something that they have to endure. And that's where the individual has to be part of this collective process as well. So it's in two directions. It's not only that we can only focus on the collective and the systemic and abandon any sort of personal responsibility, but also we can't become so subsumed into the idea of personal or individual change that we lose sight of our collective responsibilities. And yeah, so there's great thinking out there if people want to access those resources.
Honestly, that's a dynamic I've only recently started to engage in, which is not doing research for the candidate that represents my views, but actually doing the work to listen to and engage with people who are marginalized, maybe more marginalized than myself in areas where I have privilege, and to listen and to cast my vote for them. Because I strongly believe that a vote for someone who has a marginalized identity is going to make my world better.
Yep.
I think another theme that just came out of that when you said that, Daniel, is for this Mars retrograde is like, what are the limits of individual interests? And I think that ties in with what Michael said as well. The connection between personal drives and how personal drives, upon closer examination, are actually interwoven with possibilities for collective progress.
And we're done with 2020. Are we?
Aquarius.
Do we want to talk about Saturn and Aquarius at all?
I think it's definitely worth we've kind of mentioned it a little bit that during 3 months in the spring, Saturn leaves Capricorn to go into Aquarius, but will not stay there as it retrogrades back into Capricorn. But there's an interesting dynamic there if you are experiencing a transit through Capricorn of Saturn or Aquarius. So for example, I'm in my Saturn return right now, which does not end in the spring when Saturn goes into Aquarius. I think of it as a pause. And if you have Saturn in your chart in Aquarius, your Saturn retrograde will begin. You'll get a 3-month preview, or Saturn return will begin. You'll have a 3-month preview. But then once it goes back into Capricorn, you'll pause that Aquarian return. And those of us with a Saturn in Capricorn will resume our return and bring it to its final conclusion in December once it leaves for another 27 years. So I think it's the way I describe it is it's not like overlapping layers. It's like forks that are kind of coming together. They're distinct periods, but the fork, if you pull it apart and look at each part of it, there's some prongs that are Aquarian, but you don't see the full Aquarius fork until later on. I don't know if that's a helpful analogy of the fork, but it's one I'm working on.
Like people are going to be going in and out of their Saturn returns this year, depending on if you have Saturn in Capricorn or Saturn Aquarius. And also, everybody is going to be feeling that energy at the same time, that shift from one to the other. So there's going to be a preview of Saturn in Aquarius, and then we're going to get more Saturn in Capricorn, and then we're going to get full-on Saturn in Aquarius and Jupiter in Aquarius starting in December. So what is a shift from Capricorn to Aquarius? Well, Daniel, you talked a little bit about the decans on this earlier. Do you want to, I feel like that was just so illustrative. Do you want to talk a little bit about that decanic shift?
I think, I think about Capricorn as building the society, building structures that last for a long, long time. And then as a result, you see classism, you see marginalization occur within any large structures. And so then Aquarius deals with the undoing and then the redoing of those structures. And I think that really speaks elementally to like the earth sign of Capricorn as being really concerned with building and understanding structures that persist over time, to the air element, which has more to do with increasing complexity, increasing our understanding of relationships between people, and how those ultimately are a dynamic that transcends some of those physical limitations that we have. The Saturn Jupiter entering Aquarius together at the end of the year, for if this is your first time hearing about that, is part of a larger 200-year cycle where Saturn and Jupiter are traveling with those conjunctions in earth signs, and now we're fully getting into air signs. And so we're entering a 20-year and a 200-year period of that air element. And I'm just really, that's like the shred of optimism I'm holding on to for our society as we move into a decade after things like Brexit, after things like what's happening in the United States, after so many leaders around the world have abused power and abused the monsters that they've seen. And I think that there's room for us to connect in different ways, and that's what I think of when I think of air. It's how do we connect with each other.
Yeah, I feel like I might be borrowing language from somebody when I think of air as a means of conveyance. Like out of all of the elements, it is the most capable of conveying ideas or conveying one particle of air to another place in space. So that idea of connection is really brought together with the air, as opposed to Earth, which is more fixed in space. Michael, did you have anything you wanted to add to where we were going?
Yeah. Three names are coming up for me as we talk through this. One was in response to something that Daniel just said about optimism and the last shred of optimism. It reminded me of something that Gordon said on Rune Soup, that optimism is a spell. And I like that idea of optimism being a spell for the future in some way, that it in itself is a kind of practice of world making. I was also thinking a lot about Austin Coppock in relation to Aquarius. There was a metaphor that Austin used years ago, discussing the rulership of Capricorn and Aquarius by Saturn. And because Saturn is the outermost visible planet, it's sort of like the outer wall of our solar system, or at least it was for a long time. and thinking of Capricorn as the inside edge of that wall, that which has existed, the past, that which has been established. And Aquarius is the other side of that same wall. It's the future. It's the structures that could be made. It's the worlds that might yet come into being. And so I'm thinking about that shift from Capricorn to Aquarius. It's still Saturn. It's still like slow, deliberate, longevity focused, legacy focused, but it has to do with this question of, I think, allegiance or devotion. What is it? Are we devoted, or are we is our allegiance with that which has come before, or is our allegiance and our devotion with that which is yet to come? And of course, I think I mentioned this earlier, like Aquarius is a fixed sign. It's not, yes, it's about conveyance, absolutely. Yes, it's about connection, but it is also about like laying down a particular structure. Sometimes the shift from earth to air can seem as if it's like totally open, and sometimes air is like that, but Aquarius, I think it's very much about inventing new structures to support us in the days ahead. And so the third name that was coming up for me as we were getting into this is Alexis Pauline Gumbs, who talks about fugitivity. And there's a lot of scholars, a lot of people use that term in their thinking. And the way that she explained it, that I really appreciate, is the idea of being so committed to a belief that you live your life in consistency with that belief, even if the existing circumstances deny the reality of that to which you're committed. And so, I mean, this is coming out of a specifically African-American experience in the United States. And so a lot of times fugitivity is used to describe the constant state of flight, of being on the run, of constantly pursued, always escaping. But she develops this line of thought around the commitment to a different kind of world. And she uses the example of Harriet Tubman saying, "My people are free," specifically at a time when all of the existing social institutions would deny that reality, would say that, in fact, your people are not free. And she believed that so strongly, and she lived her life so consistently, and that's the Aquarius part, the consistent commitment to another possibility that brings a different world literally into being. And so I'm thinking about that shift from Capricorn to Aquarius being a shift from allegiance to existing structures, which is part of what Saturn has been doing with Pluto and the South Node in Capricorn, is the examination and the pressure on existing structures to change, or to the bringing to light their insufficiency. And then Saturn's transition into Aquarius being, okay, what other worlds can we dream up? What other systems do we have to develop in order to make those worlds possible, in order to, as Daniel said, bring us into a different kind of connection to one another, in order to usher in something more like justice, which is something we can't even yet imagine. We don't know what that is. But how do we commit to it in the present in order to make it possible in the future? So it feels like part of what that process, that shift is, for me, is, or how I'm thinking about it, is this question of what kind of world are you committing to in the future that's not yet arrived? What kind of possibilities for support are you devoted to, or are putting your allegiance to, that is specifically different from what has come before, that shift from Capricorn to Aquarius? And optimism might be part of that spell that we work in order to make such worlds possible.
I loved everything that you just said, and I also am not confident in optimism.
I agree. I mean, Lauren Berlant taught us to, like, optimism is cruel. There's a cruelty to optimism. I agree.
And what about optimism can be cruel is when it obscures that which is actually hurting you.
Right.
So but I really like this idea of committing and going away from an allegiance to existing structures toward a commitment for a vision. I think there's a very important difference between optimism and visioning. Like being optimistic about something is like, oh yeah, it'll be okay. Like I'm happy with where things are, or like I believe that this could go in a certain way. Versus it's kind of like airy fairy, but Saturn air is not airy fairy. That was funny. Saturn air is that committed. It's that fixed energy. So I don't know. I just think that optimism, I'm wary of it, but that doesn't mean that I think it's totally unapplicable.
I think about an image that came to mind, Michael, when you were talking about Harriet Tubman, and I thought about the image on the Six of Swords, which is the fixed decan of the fixed sign of Aquarius, the corresponding card in the tarot, as being a boat that is being sailed off into the unknown. There's that Frozen 2 again. And the boat has 6 swords in the bottom of it. And the thing that came to mind is, if you believe that those swords have created this reality that that boat is not going to make it to its destination, you won't get in that boat. You are not going to go off into the unknown. You are not going to pass go and envision new possibilities for your people. And if you go into that boat committed to an idea that I'm going to not pull those swords out and then I can get that to my destination, because as long as those swords stay where they are, the water won't come rushing in from this lake that I'm crossing, or this river. I think it's that in order to get to the next level, or in order to provide for a longer term possibility, you may need to commit to a current. We talked about this on another episode. You may need to commit to the understanding that you will not see the fruits of that vision come to fruition. And none of that discusses who the hell put those swords in the boat. Like, and I think that's kind of what, Drew, your caution of optimism reminds me of. It's like, if we're so committed to doing the exploration so that we can get to that innovative worldview, and we miss the part where it's like, wait a minute, there's the system that is actively oppressing us. Can we address that instead? And I think part of the reality is we have to do both. Mm-hmm. We need people who are able to ignore the fact that those swords are in us and be committed to that vision of the future, at the same time as we need people who are actively working to dismantle. Not that they're mutually exclusive, but I think it goes back to that idea of no single one of us can be the hero that saves us all. Mm-hmm. We all play a part, and together those parts are in a pattern that creates this movement, that creates this freedom, this continued resistance.
I totally agree. And I also think about people who have a lot of Aquarius in their chart. And I don't think of people who are like, oh, I'm just going to like go do this thing. That's way more Sag. Like when I think of Aquarius, I think way more like deadpan, like detached. I don't like the word detached, but deadpan, committed. It's this, it's a fixity of ideas. And I think that coming from all of the dismantling that's been in Capricorn with the South Node, I think that's going to be a very welcome shift. Like finally you can latch onto something. Finally you can latch onto a vision, a Saturnian long-term vision, rather than just seeing them all disappear in the South Node.
I agree. And I appreciate the suspicion of optimism. I agree with that suspicion. And I think that caution is worth holding on to. I think in terms of optimism, I'm here, and I agree that that's far more Sagittarian than Aquarian.
I feel seen.
You are seen. We see you. That perhaps a more first, maybe optimism as an alternative to nihilism, maybe is part of like nothing can change. It will all remain the same. Optimism is sort of like holding on to the possibility that things can be otherwise, which that in and of itself is not enough. It's not enough to only believe that things can be otherwise. And so I'm coming back to Adrienne Ray Brown again. Of course I am. Which is that we're living in an imagination battle. Like we are living in someone else's, a whole collective imagination that the world is this way. The world is based on consumption and capitalism, that there are races of people that are superior to others, that there is a normal or a right way to love and desire, that there is a essential, persistent binary gender, and so on, like that we're living in an ongoing practical imagination, by which I mean people are living out this imagination, which is what makes it real. So then Aquarius is this call to imagine and live out a different world that we imagine to be possible. So the optimism perhaps is, yes, it is possible for there to be another world. What is that? How do we commit to it? And how do we live that imagination into reality in contradiction or in counterpoint to the world that has been imagined to be as it is? Like that feels like the shift in the what do we, I don't know, it's sort of like, what do we believe to be most true, and how do we commit to that?
And I think that to merge a couple conversations we're having here, it matters who is optimistic. It matters that we're optimistic with other people, and that we're not just holding on to optimism that we can do something alone. Yeah. I think about optimism becomes inspiration when you share it with someone. And optimism is usually not based on a willy-nilly sense of reality, but it's like, no, I've seen that, or I believe so strongly in that I'm going to inspire this person to action. Also a theme heavily explored in Star Wars Episode 9, Rise of Skywalker. So there's just so many points in that film at which people are about to lose hope, and you as the audience are right there with them. And they always, again, I don't think I'm doing spoilers, they always turn to someone that has inspired them in the past, and their last, like, that's the person they're expressing their sense of defeat to. And that person inevitably is talking about an example of where we did not lose hope, or there's still hope out there. There's still someone out there who's fighting. We need to continue fighting for them too. That it's a reciprocal process. There's something about that's explored too in Octavia Butler's work in the Patternist series, as they face this villain that has persisted over millennia. And it is that strength of having hope, but then sharing that becomes critical to being able to survive and accomplish something together. So I don't want to perseverate on this, but I think that it's that there's a definite role that I see for optimism, but it's not, again, in a self right. It's not an egotistical way. It's in a, like, how do I provide this fuel for other people to continue to work, knowing that I might receive that too.
Yeah, I like that, thinking about optimism as fuel, like going somewhere together, like that Aquarian vehicle versus the Sagittarian one, which might be a little more like me, but Aquarius being the us. Yeah.
So I'm reading this book, Leaders Eat Last by Simon Sinek. I wasn't going to read it because I felt that it represented the centralized leadership perspective, and I'm trying to really study decentralized leadership right now. And then I read it a little more closely and realized that I think it does a good job of describing ways that centralized leadership can be compassionate and can be empowering and uplifting. And I think that's not happening in 90% of situations. And so it's like, we don't need to argue that the centralized leader is always bad. And the whole premise of the book is that centralized leaders eat last because they know that as long as everyone feels cared for, they will be loyal to each other. There's a strength of community that they feel. And as a leader, others might say, well, you deserve to eat first because you're our leader. And we look at that in terms of compensating leaders, in terms of privileges afforded leaders in our society. And a leader that's effective, Simon Sinek argues, would reject that and say, I'm not going to eat until I make sure that every single person here has enough. That's not sustainable. That leadership style, for me, doesn't feel sustainable. And so I always think, I've been thinking as I've been studying that book, what does it mean for all of us to eat together? Why does someone have to eat last? I mean, I know how time works. I get how resources work. But I think there's a different rhetoric and a narrative that is accomplished through the dialogue around we're eating together. We are, as a community, ensuring that everyone has enough to eat. I don't know. I don't know if it's possible to completely decentralize leadership within organizations or movements. I think there's going to be a balance. And I think Aquarius helps us reflect on what we've committed to and where we might be able to adjust without abandoning our entire direction.
What I observe in the organization that I'm a part of is that a scarcity mindset, like you're talking about, Daniel, with like who eats first, who eats last, the idea that there's not enough to go around. So often I see a scarcity mindset leading to forcing black and white decisions that did not need to happen. And it's a very Capricornian thing. It's like, there's only this much to go around. I need to put the wall here, and it's going to be either on the inside or the outside. So if Capricorn is scarcity, then what is, learning to adapt to scarcity, then what is Aquarius? Like, what has Aquarius learned from Capricorn and the experience of scarcity? I don't know what the word is, but maybe you'll have some ideas.
Well, I love the tarot card for Aquarius. I believe that's Temperance, if I'm not mistaken.
It's Sag, I think it's the star, isn't it?
Oh, you're right. Well, that one works even better. Okay, so then what I will say about the tarot card for Aquarius is it is that way shower. It inspires. That star has an optimism, even if you don't know if you'll ever get to that star. What's that saying? Shoot on the moon.
Land amongst the clouds. Land amongst the stars.
I always hated that one because I was like, that doesn't make sense. But I think it's that same idea for me, is that there's something about Aquarius that's impossible, and yet it's impossible not to have that as a way forward. Well, should we express some gratitude for our audience for staying with us?
Yes, thank you, audience. Love you so much. All of you on Twitter, keep on queering astrology.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I've loved the community that we've been able to start to have dialogues with through this podcast. So as I think about like 2020 and my own, not resolutions, but the idea that we're always taking stock and reflecting all the time. And as we transition the number of the year to 2020, I continue to really be humbled by this community that we're a part of. And I continue to invite participation. I love that this podcast is not just people talking to hear themselves talk, but it's actually trying to have a dialogue with people, mostly on Twitter. But I've been really happy to hear and see the ways that people are finding queer skies. And so I continue to just invite everyone to share this podcast with others, and to continue to let us know if you have ideas for future guests or future episode topics. And as we talk about the future of queer skies and envision the possibilities, that is important input that we seek. So thank you.
Second that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's been so cool to see more. I think people are really interested in like the genderedness of astrology and how that can work out. I've seen people really interested in moving toward diurnal and nocturnal as opposed to masculine and feminine. Jason Hawley doing some work on that, and I think triggering a lot of conversations in the Twitterverse, as well as Michael has done some wonderful threads about gender and astrology. I think these conversations are really cropping up, and I can't wait to see what they turn into at conferences. Like, ooh, we're going to chat, we're going to talk. It's going to be so fun.
Well, I'm really grateful for the two of you for continuing to hold this space and create opportunities for meaningful dialogue, both in this call, in this recording, but also the ways that it circulates after, that the willingness to initiate the conversation is part of what makes the conversation possible. So thanks for doing that.
Let's go Mars.
Well, and with that, I hope everyone has a wonderful end of 2019 and a beautiful beginning to 2020 and beyond. Thanks for watching or listening, and we will see you later.